The worst part was not the termination papers. It was the small, clipped laugh Ethan Cross let out when he saw the clipboard in my hand. As if paper was the most dangerous thing in a room full of glowing screens and overconfident people. But in refrigerated freight, the paper has never been what breaks a company. Arrogance does. It always has. I knew that meeting was headed somewhere ugly the moment Ethan Cross laughed at the clipboard in my hand. It was not a loud laugh. Not the kind meant to entertain the room. It was sharper than that. Smaller. More insulting. The kind of sound a man makes when he thinks he has already placed you in the past. Around us, the war room glowed blue with route maps, weather alerts, shipment clocks, truck pings, and refrigerated load tracking. Everything looked sleek, modern, and expensive. The perfect stage for people who mistake polished screens for operational truth. Ethan stood at the head of the table with that posture I had come to recognize over the years. The posture of a man who thinks vocabulary like transformation and modernization somehow counts as competence. I did not respond to his laugh. I set my binder down, opened it, and checked a handwritten note about a slow bay in Knoxville and a driver whose medical restrictions still had not synced properly in the system. That, to me, was the real work. Not speeches. Not branding. Not ego. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 48 years old. And for 11 years at Iron Ridge, I was the person standing between a shipment arriving clean and a report explaining why it did not. Ethan looked at my clipboard and saw something outdated. I looked at him and saw a man who did not yet understand the business he was so eager to remake. If he could not grasp why I still carried paper, then he definitely did not understand what that paper had been preventing all these years. I never needed praise to know my job mattered. Most of what I did at Iron Ridge lived in the gray space presentations, like to ignore. I knew which docs looked reliable in the system, but slipped rhythm when a shift supervisor changed. I knew which routes were technically open and still not worth gambling on when the freight behind them was temperature sensitive. I knew which small exceptions never looked important enough to make it onto a dashboard and still had the power to cost a company money. Contracts, or credibility. So, when Mason Reed from Vector Lane turned his laptop toward me and showed me a neat map full of clean lines and confident arrows, I was not impressed. I was listening for what was missing. He spoke about centralized control, faster reaction time, and removing manual dependencies, and every sentence made the gap wider. To him, dispatch was a data flow. To me, dispatch was a chain of judgment calls that had to be made before consequences hardened into damage. Daniel Brooks stood near the door with a coffee in his hand. Quiet in the way smart people get when they realize the room has already stopped being honest. He knew, just like I did, that this was no longer a systems discussion. It was theater. And I had been cast as the symbol of everything they wanted to call old. The truth was, I had never tried to make the company dependent on me. I had only spent years carrying the parts of the operation nobody else had bothered to name. And the minute they started calling those parts habits, I understood something colder than anger. People love to label something outdated right before they destroy the very thing that has been holding them upright. Mason angled the screen toward me like he was offering proof of the future, while Ethan leaned back in his chair and enjoyed the feeling of being the man opening the door to it. The dashboard was all blue and green, the trucks moving across a map that looked almost too smooth to be real. Mason talked about eliminating manual drag, consolidating dispatch authority, and increasing speed. I let him finish before I asked one simple question. What happens when the exceptions hit? He blinked and said the platform handled routing. I looked directly at him. That is not what I asked. That was the moment I understood the danger clearly. Not the software itself. The people using software as a substitute for operational memory. Ethan stepped in and said the company could not keep building around habits. Habit. Such a tidy word for judgment, prevention, and experience. I did not raise my voice. I just opened my binder, marked a route adjustment, and let my silence do what arguments could not. A few people in the room looked down. Daniel stayed still, because he knew I was not trying to win the room. I was measuring how blind the people in charge had decided to be. If you have ever watched someone mock the very thing they do not understand. Comment number 1. So I know I am not the only one who has seen that kind of arrogance up close. I remember Ethan saying it was 2026 and that I needed to stop using paper. All I could think about were the drivers already out on the road. The docks that closed late. The loads that did not care what year it was. Roads do not reward confidence. They punish bad judgment. After that meeting, I went back to the dispatch floor and did what I always did after a man like Ethan finished performing. I checked the things that actually kept freight moving. A driver restriction update still had not been pushed through. One handwritten note in my binder still had a warning underlined twice telling me not to send a sensitive load through the pass. A temperature packet for a refrigerated shipment sat clipped beneath a blue tab, because one badly timed delay could turn good product into a write-off. On paper, those things probably looked old. In real operations, they looked like prevention. I moved from desk to desk, correcting a dock note by hand, rerouting a load away from a path the software still insisted was acceptable, and pausing over a file for a driver whose exemption was taking too long to sync. Nobody thanked me. Nobody had to. But by late morning, when Olivia Hart from HR sent me a calendar invite called Process Alignment Discussion, I knew the insult in the war room had only been the beginning. Soon after, Ethan's memo landed across the floor announcing paperless transformation. Phase 1. Mason followed with a prettier version full of polished language about removing duplicated manual dependencies and centralizing control. Daniel passed by my desk without looking at me and muttered that they thought the binder was a habit, when really it was the fallback. I did not answer. I quietly scanned keynotes to a private drive, slipped my old root notebook into my bag, and made sure my continuity packet was still where I kept it. Once people start calling the safeguards redundant, the smartest thing you can do is prepare for the moment the screens stop knowing how to save them. The room they used for the final meeting was too small for the kind of decision Ethan wanted to make in it, which is exactly why I think he chose it. Bad decisions like tight rooms, they leave people less space to breathe and less room to push back. Olivia was already seated when I walked in. Mason sat beside Ethan with his laptop open like he was there to witness a milestone instead of help engineer a mistake. Ethan did not ask me to sit down. He folded his hands and looked at me with the expression of a man who had already rehearsed my replacement in his mind. He said Iron Ridge could not move into the future if it kept building around paper. Memory-based control. And legacy gatekeeping. I listened, then told him not to strip out the manual continuity layer until Vector Lane survived one real exception cycle. Mason jumped in immediately, talking about scalable modernization and clean dispatch architecture with no human bottleneck. I asked the only question that mattered. What happens when the exception actually hits? Ethan hated that I stayed calm. My calm made him look smaller than his own tone did. Then he repeated himself, said it was 2026, and told me to stop using paper. I did not argue. I only looked at him the way I might look at a driver taking the wrong exit at full speed while still believing he was in control. That was when he fired me. Effective immediately, Olivia slid the termination paperwork across the table far too quickly for this to be anything but pre-planned. I stood up without begging, without shouting. Before I walked out, I texted Daniel one sentence. No live dispatch. No moving trucks. If this kind of corporate power play feels painfully familiar, like the video, so more people can hear this story. A minute later, Daniel read my text, looked up at the wall of screens, and went pale. He understood what Ethan had just done. I left Iron Ridge carrying a cardboard box so small it felt insulting. A mug. 2 pens I actually liked. A cracked phone charger. A little metal truck one of the dispatchers had given me after a brutal holiday stretch a few winters earlier. None of it explained what I had really been carrying through that building for 11 years. My value was never sitting in a desk drawer. It lived in route notes, escalation paths, remembered exceptions, and dozens of small corrections made before anyone else realized they were needed. Inside the building, they started cleaning the place, the way people clean when they believe they are erasing the past instead of gutting their own resilience. Binders were stacked and hauled away. Whiteboards were wiped clean. Handwritten reroute slips that people used when the system lagged were suddenly being called redundant. Mason and his team moved across the floor like they were unveiling a renovated kitchen. Ethan took a slow walk between the rows of desks with his jacket open and his chin raised, as if he had finally cleared out some old smell he found offensive. Then the smaller things began disappearing. Exception tags, the refrigerated escalation tree, the list of docs that looked normal in a report and lied in person, the habits dispatchers built with drivers after years of hearing the same voices call in from the same highways. I sat in a coffee shop across the street with my box at my feet and saw my job from a different angle for the first time. It was not a title. It was a load-bearing layer nobody had ever respected enough to name. I did not call anyone. I did not log back in. I just sat there and understood that Iron Ridge had thrown away the part that kept their software from believing too much in itself. My phone lit up again and again that afternoon, and I let every call disappear into silence. From across the street, I could almost imagine the shape of the confusion starting to spread through Iron Ridge. Drivers calling in for route clarification. New authority figures answering too slowly, too flatly, and too wrong in that special way people do when they know the words, but not the road. Ethan probably called it transition noise. By the end of the day, the company still sent out the victory email anyway, announcing that the vector lane dispatch migration was fully operational. I saw the message in preview and felt something colder than surprise. Men like Ethan never stop at removing the person who warns them. They always need the applause that comes from declaring success too early. I sat there with cooling coffee and thought about the routes that only looked safe until refrigerated freight entered the equation. I thought about the dock in Louisville that drifted late during a shift change. I thought about the mountain pass I had flagged because being technically open had never meant being worth the risk. None of those realities would ever glow brightly on a dashboard, but they stayed vivid in the mind of anyone who had ever had to absorb the cost when systems got too neat. I did not feel triumphant sitting outside that building. I felt hollow. The worst pain was not getting fired. It was sitting on the other side of the glass, watching the place, still glowing with normalcy, while knowing more clearly than anyone inside that the calm they were celebrating was just the silence. Before Damage learned how to speak, by the next morning, Ethan had moved beyond defending his decision. He wanted a showcase. That is the thing about men like him. Surviving is never enough. They need to be seen winning. So he picked a refrigerated cluster tied to Silver Peak Foods to prove Vector Lane could handle real volume. On the surface, it was the kind of freight that would look impressive if it went well. Underneath, it was all tight windows, sensitive handoffs, dock exceptions, and temperature risk. Daniel did not dress up his warning. He said not to use that cluster. Too many dock variables. Too many handoffs that depended on judgment more than timing. Ethan barely looked at him. In his mind, every warning now belonged in the same bucket, labeled fear of change. That phrase always amuses me. People love calling caution weakness when they are not the ones signing off on the losses. Olivia helped clear the path with a clean internal note, saying transition readiness was complete. Leadership was aligned. And rollout was confirmed. The language was so polished it almost felt immoral. For the first few hours, everything on the dashboard stayed green and obedient. I imagine Ethan must have felt a private thrill in that. He probably thought he was about to win more than an operational argument. He thought he was winning a story about age, relevance, and who belonged in the future. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. From the outside, though, I saw something much older than innovation. The prettier a system looks, the more dangerous it becomes when the people in charge stop checking what is hiding underneath it. For the first few hours of rollout, the whole thing looked stable enough to feed a dangerous illusion. The routes on the dashboard glowed green. Estimated arrival windows stayed tucked inside their safe little boxes. Trucks moved. I was not there. But I could picture Ethan standing a little straighter, speaking a little slower, enjoying the sensation that he was about to prove the old guard had only ever been a drag. Then he called Rachel Sloan at Silver Peak. That call was the first real fracture line. Ethan bragged that Iron Ridge had removed paper dependency, that the new system was cleaner, faster, and more modern. Rachel did not congratulate him. She asked one question. Had they changed live dispatch control without clearly flagging the risk exposure? That question told me all I needed to know about her. People who understand live operations hear danger in places. Polished people hear momentum. Ethan answered too smoothly, too confidently, with the kind of response designed to close a door that should have been opened wider. And right around then, the first exception alerts started blinking out of rhythm on the floor. Not loudly, not dramatically, just wrong. Wrong in the way that makes experienced operators go cold. Daniel saw it first. Vector Lane was not reading the route like a living sequence of handoffs. It was reading flat data. Then one refrigerated load got pushed toward the exact crossdock I had once marked by hand as never crossdock here. I did not need to be standing there to know the room had changed temperature. Nothing had exploded yet. But I knew the failure had already found the opening it needed. Real damage rarely arrives like a dramatic blast. It comes like grit slipping into machinery. Small enough at first that arrogant people believe they still have time. It started with one dock running late. Then, a temperature alert surfaced on a refrigerated load. Then one reroute began colliding with another. Then, a driver's legal hours started closing faster than the system expected. Each problem alone was still manageable. Together, they required judgment, and judgment was the very thing Ethan and Mason thought they had removed from the decision chain. Vector Lane did what bad systems always do under pressure. It optimized what it could measure and ignored what it was supposed to understand. That made everything worse. The platform lagged at exactly the point where decisions should have tightened. Sequence packets stopped generating on time. Authority blurred. The trucks were still moving, but the order holding them together had started to fray. Then the refrigerated load got pushed into a crossdock with no proper cold berth. No flames. No crash. It just sat in the wrong place long enough for the internal temperature to drift past the safe threshold. Quiet damage is often the most expensive kind. I knew that because I had spent years preventing exactly that sort of thing from happening. While Ethan kept calling what he saw a technical delay, Daniel saw the truth immediately. 3 drivers were now waiting on directions that nobody could give cleanly, correctly, and with the right authority. At that point, it was no longer a software issue. It was an operational void. And operational voids swallow money much faster than any algorithm can predict. Once the manual continuity layer had been stripped out, nobody was left with both the authority and the understanding to step into the gap before it widened. Calls started stacking on top of each other. Drivers? Dispatchers? Clients? Everyone wanted immediate answers. And the system was now generating slow, flat, sometimes contradictory responses. Before Ethan could shape the narrative, Rachel's side had already received alerts of their own. Then someone pulled up the fully operational email Ironridge had sent. Then Ethan's proud remarks about removing paper dependency suddenly sounded much uglier than they had the day before. They had changed live dispatch control. They had not clearly flagged real risk. They had promised more than the platform could carry. One failure exposed everything under it. Not just the software, but the arrogance, the shortcut taking, and the family-powered confidence behind the decision. My phone vibrated across the cafe table over and over again. I watched it glow, then go dark. Glow, then go dark. I did not touch it. I had no interest in rescuing them. But beneath the anger was something sadder. I knew drivers were sitting out on real roads waiting for instructions from a structure that had just cut out the one layer designed to bear live pressure. There are different kinds of betrayal at work. One is being pushed out the door. Another is watching the place you spent years stabilizing. Use your humiliation as an excuse to remove the last supports it had left. I thought I would feel more furious than I did. But when the collapse truly began, what I felt most clearly was grief. After that, the damage stopped looking like one bad incident and started looking like an entire company forgetting how to move. Trucks were left waiting because the route authority on screen no longer matched the instructions reaching the cab. Refrigerated loads sat in limbo while people argued about who owned the escalation path. Some drivers refused to keep going when what they saw on screen did not match what they were hearing over the phone. I did not blame them. People on the road are usually the first to pay for reckless confidence generated in conference rooms. Silver Peak froze part of the freight and demanded an incident file. That was the moment panic spread. Once one major client stopped asking polite questions, every other client started listening harder. Then insurance got involved. Then risk review wanted to know who approved live migration controls and why the fallback layer had been removed first. Inside Iron Ridge, the reports did not even align with each other. Ethan called it a contained event. Daniel in operations called it what it was, a continuity failure across the system. I learned those details later. But in that moment, the number of missed calls on my phone told me enough. I took a sip of coffee gone fully cold and realized there is a very specific kind of silence that falls when people begin choking on the words they once said too confidently. They called me the bottleneck. They called the binder obsolete. They said the future would not need human memory. And now the whole structure was circling around one question they should have asked from the start. Who understands the point at which data alone stops being enough? Ethan called me once, and I let it ring. He called again, and I answered only because I wanted to hear what a man sounds like when the room around him finally gets too small. I could hear him breathing before he even spoke. The polish was gone. The practiced confidence from the day he fired me was gone. All that remained was urgency squeezed tight by fear. I did not give him much. I told him he had already replaced me, so he should try, replacing the part he never understood. Then I hung up, not because I needed the satisfaction, because some lessons lose all their meaning if the person harmed keeps cushioning the fall of the person who caused it. Olivia kept trying to frame everything as temporary disruption. But by then, the email chain had started speaking for all of them. Mason wanted to deploy a hot patch, as though a platform they had called fully operational could somehow recover its dignity by begging for emergency fixes. That only made everything look worse. I sat in a different cafe that afternoon with my old root notebook open in front of me. Not because I was planning to save Iron Ridge, but because I wanted to see my work clearly from the outside for once. Every short note in that book was compressed knowledge. A dock that ran late when a shift changed. A route that looked fine until temperature-sensitive freight entered the picture. A delay pattern that software always treated as too minor to matter until the consequences started accumulating, page after page. I stopped seeing myself as a former employee. I started seeing myself as the woman who had carried the company's shock absorbers in silence for years. When people tell you that your expertise is just habit, sometimes what they really mean is that your competence makes them feel smaller than they can bear. By evening, Henry Cole had seen enough. I was not in the boardroom when he demanded the termination timeline, the rollout memo, and every email tied to the migration. But I did not need to be there to understand the pressure in that room. Once a failure hits a client, hits insurance, and hits risk review, people with real authority lose patience for presentation language very quickly. They begin asking who signed, who approved, and who promised. Those are not questions Ethan could answer with blue graphics or modernization slogans. From what Daniel later told me, the emergency meeting brought legal, operations, HR, Ethan, and Mason into one room. Henry did not let anyone hide behind polished phrasing for long. He asked who approved the live migration, who signed the memo, who authorized my termination in a role directly tied to active freight movement, and who told Silver Peak the system was fully operational. There are rooms that only change temperature when people are forced to look straight at the damage they have been packaging too elegantly. Corporate life runs on the fantasy that if you clean up your wording enough, the harm will somehow become easier to live with. But spoiled refrigerated freight, suspended accounts, and drivers waiting on instruction do not care how polished your internal language sounds. They expose competence the old-fashioned way. And the moment Henry started pulling those decisions out from under their glossy finish, I knew the story had reached the part where titles alone could no longer shelter anyone. Operational truth always trails ego by a few steps. But once it catches up, it does not leave room to hide. The moment that changed the room was not a legal explanation. It was Daniel finally saying out loud what Ethan had never been willing to understand. He explained that the manual continuity layer was not some outdated preference of mine. It was the fallback for every place software still failed to understand real life. When a dock slipped rhythm without warning, when legal drive hours tightened faster than expected, when a refrigerated handoff demanded a judgment call that could not wait. That layer kept the whole structure from dropping into freefall. That shifted the frame of the meeting immediately. Legal stopped treating the situation like a bad rollout and started treating it like exposure. Not only because the failure had happened, but because a sensitive control layer had been removed without clear warning, because family influence had overridden operational judgment, and because HR had processed a hot termination in a role directly connected to moving freight. Olivia could no longer float above it. Mason tried to talk his way through with technical phrasing, but every sentence only made it clearer that he had built for clean conditions, not living freight. Ethan kept reaching for the same defense that this was resistance to change, until Henry cut him off. This was not a generation gap. It was a chain of terrible judgment dressed up in the language of the future. When Daniel told me that later, I could almost feel the silence settling over the table. I did not need to be there to defend myself. My absence by then carried more weight than any speech I could have given. They could lose the account. They could lose money. They could lose position. But nobody in that room had the right to summon me back just because they had finally learned the proper name for what I used to carry. In the days that followed, the ending did not arrive with a grand speech. It came the way real endings usually do. Through memos. Silence. Missing names on org charts. And doors that no longer opened for certain people. Ethan was pulled out of the transformation effort almost immediately. And not much later, he was pushed out of operations entirely. Mason and Vector Lane were cut loose from Iron Ridge. But worse than losing the contract was the fact that their names started circulating in the industry for the wrong reasons. Olivia kept her job, but not her reach. She was removed from every sensitive personnel decision as the governance review widened. Silver Peak did not come back. That loss stayed on the books where no wording could soften it. Inside Iron Ridge, people who had been too afraid to speak honestly finally started saying what they had known all along. I had never made the company dependent on me. The company had simply chosen not to understand the value of what I was carrying. Daniel became the person everyone wanted to talk to, because he had been standing close enough to watch the story change before leadership language could sanitize it. Some of the old dispatchers even pulled handwritten notes back out of discard piles as if they were salvaging more than paper. Henry issued a new internal rule saying no continuity control could ever be removed simply to make a technology story sound cleaner. When I heard that, I did not feel victorious. I felt something quieter. A light confirmation. The kind that cannot undo humiliation, but can still prove that the truth eventually reaches the room that mattered most. Then came the email I had known was coming all along. Long. Careful. Full of apology. Money. Flexibility. And the kind of respect companies suddenly discover after they realize they have mispriced a person. The language softened. The tone lowered. The same people who had framed me as a bottleneck were now describing my experience as invaluable. I read it once, closed the laptop, and said nothing. My silence was not pride. It was dignity. By then, I understood that some moments can only be answered by refusing to give the institution one more word to work with. From my seat by the window, I watched the line of traffic outside and thought about all the mornings I had walked into Iron Ridge before the rush. About the tiny route notes nobody noticed. About the way I had spent years absorbing the errors other people like to describe as rare. For a long time, I believed loyalty could teach a workplace to see a good worker clearly. But some organizations only learn your value after they spend a few days living without the hands that used to steady them. I turned my phone face down on the table and felt something inside me loosen. It was not the anger of the day I was fired. It was not the sadness of watching the system crack from outside the glass. It was simply clarity. Iron Ridge no longer had any claim on my voice. They could offer money. They could offer softer titles, flexible terms, more careful language, but they could not return to the room where Ethan laughed at my clipboard and mistook it for the past, instead of recognizing it as the final support beam under the whole operation. A few weeks later, Iron Ridge still had not found its footing. The legal review was still open. Silver Peak was gone for good. A few other clients had reduced volume because nobody wanted to become the next cautionary tale. Leadership had shifted twice in less than a month. The kind of chair movement companies love to call restructuring, when really they are just trying to place someone outside the blast radius. Even from the outside, I could feel the place stumbling. Trying to pretend a broken spine was just bad posture. I did not go back. I did not sign with anyone else either. Most mornings, I took my coffee to a little place near the highway where, if the light hit right, you could see the freight lanes in the distance, like threads that never slept. My old route notebook sat beside my cup every time. Not as a shrine. Not as a wound. More like evidence that something once dismissed as small could still carry the shape of an entire working life. Sometimes the television over the counter would flash a short update about Iron Ridge. Delayed shipments. Contract suspension. Leadership shakeup. I never leaned in. I never smiled. By then, I no longer needed revenge to be loud in order to know it had arrived. Some consequences are most beautiful when they are simply the truth, staying visible long enough that nobody can twist it back into a cleaner story. I sat there turning pages and felt peace come back in a form I had not expected. Not from defeating anyone, but from finally stepping away from a place that only knew how to name my value after first insulting it. Some mornings I opened the notebook just to look at the brief lines inside it. Dock names, fuel stops, warning marks beside places that seemed harmless until they were not. Iron Ridge used to call that paper, as if paper meant weakness. But roads have never cared what a man calls a thing. Roads only respond to what holds under pressure when timing starts breaking apart. I think people are the same. Some places only learn your value when your hands are no longer there to steady what they keep dropping. If someone had asked me years earlier whether I imagined leaving Iron Ridge like this, I would have said no. I thought I would leave on a more ordinary day, with a more decent handoff, with less bitterness attached to it. But workplaces rarely give women like me tidy endings. They take away the respect first, and then act surprised when we do not come back to help clean up the wreckage. I did not spend my days dreaming about revenge. Honestly, what I wanted most, after everything was space wide enough to hear my own thoughts again without leadership slogans crowding into them. And eventually, I got it. A coffee shop near a main road, morning light across the table, freight moving somewhere in the distance, my old notebook resting quietly beside me. It does not look like victory the way people usually imagine it. But maybe maturity is recognizing that peace is the rarest reward after you have spent years using up your strength to keep a workplace from injuring itself. When I think back now, I do not remember Ethan's face as clearly as I remember the feeling of my hand resting on the old notebook while I looked through the window toward the freight lanes in the pale morning light. I used to think the future belonged to the people who stayed, endured, and kept proving their usefulness to those in power. After all of this, I know better. Some roads only open once you stop driving, for a place that never deserved the route you were carrying. Iron Ridge only learned how to respect me after the collapse became too expensive to reinterpret. To May, that was never an invitation to return. It was only the final proof that leaving is not always a loss. Some departures are the first clean mile after years of hauling weight for people who were never going to value it properly. If anyone asked me whether I regret walking away, my answer would be no. I regret being loyal too long to a place that only understood my worth once it turned into a financial wound. But I do not regret the step that carried me out the door. Maybe the future was never behind me the way Ethan wanted me to believe. Maybe it had only been blocked by a system too comfortable, using my strength while calling it habit. And now, with nobody standing over me, laughing at my clipboard, I can finally think about what comes next with a feeling I had almost forgotten was possible. Calm. Certainty. Ownership. This time, the future is mine.